Evelyn was only a little girl, full of questions and wonder, and I was doing my best to keep up with her curiosity. We were walking through a park near our home. I could see her bright green eyes light up with every butterfly she spotted, every ant carrying a leaf. Her fascination with the world around her was endless. "Mama, why are all the butterflies different colors?" she asked me, pointing eagerly at a garden filled with marigolds and daisies. I smiled, holding her small hand in mine, and tried to keep up with her relentless pace of questions. I told her, "Each color has its own meaning, sweetheart. Like little party dresses, some are to attract friends, and some to hide from enemies." I remember being amazed by her thirst for knowledge, a trait she surely inherited from her father. Michael passed away 5 years ago, leaving us with an emptiness that still lingers. Evelyn, even in her innocence, felt his absence keenly. Yet, she pushed forward, her childlike wonder carrying her through. I used to watch her interact with other kids at the park. She'd organize games of detective, leading small groups of children on hunts for clues hidden behind bushes and trees. "Come on, team. We need to find the smiling tree next." I remember her saying, her voice full of authority and excitement as she pointed towards a tree that seemed to have a face. Between activities, she would look up at the sky, watching the birds fly. "I wonder if that bird is going home," she'd say aloud, a thought that seemed to cross her mind often. Home and family, especially the idea of her father, always brought a mixture of joy and sadness. She missed him, I knew that. We both did. Later that day, as we were heading home, I couldn't help but admire her resilience. "Evelyn, did you solve all the mysteries today?" I asked, noticing the little notebook full of notes and drawings about the cases she'd cracked. She beamed up at me, "I think so. But there will be more tomorrow, right?" Her smile warmed my heart, reminding me that life still held surprises worth discovering. Evelyn's spirit has a way of reminding everyone around her of that simple truth. As for me, I'm Kelly. 5 years ago, I lost my husband, Michael, in a car accident. It was a loss that shook me to my core, both emotionally and financially. Despite the grief, I pushed on, determined to be strong for my daughter. I wanted to give her the best of everything, even if it meant working late shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted but knowing I had done my best. Walking down those quiet hallways after a long shift, I often thought of Michael. "Feels like it was just yesterday," I'd whisper to myself, adjusting the bag on my shoulder. Losing him meant more than raising Evelyn alone. It meant endless hours of overtime, feeling the pinch of every bill, and carrying a burden I never expected. Coming home to find Evelyn already asleep, her mystery novel splayed open beside her, I'd sit by her bed and stroke her hair. "I will do whatever it takes to give you everything you deserve, my little treasure," I would whisper, feeling a mix of pride and pain. It's not easy, but every day I remind myself that I have to keep going. For her. For us. I remember those moments so vividly, the days when I promised myself I would stay strong for my daughter. Even when it felt like the weight of the world was on my shoulders, I knew I had to keep going, for her. Michael's death hit me hard. It wasn't just the emotional toll, it was the financial one, too. Suddenly, I was the only one responsible for everything, every little expense for Evelyn. One rare, quiet afternoon, I was in the kitchen making tea, and I found myself thinking about all the sacrifices I'd made. I remember muttering to myself, maybe I should think about taking that full-time job. It was a job in home care that had been offered to me recently, one that paid better than what I was doing. But taking that job would mean spending less time with Evelyn. And that thought, well, it weighed heavily on my heart. I recall talking to Morgan on the phone, pouring out my troubles. Her brother, Christopher Davis, is bedridden and in need of home care. I told her, I just want Evelyn to have all the opportunities one never did. To go to a good school and know her mother did everything she could for her. I was standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the night sky as I spoke, feeling the pull between wanting to give her the world and needing to be there with her. I arrived early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. I wanted to make a good impression, to show him that I was here for him, ready to help in any way I could. When I walked into his house, it felt strangely peaceful. The neighborhood was quiet, and there was a well-kept garden out front. I later learned that Morgan, Christopher's sister, took great pride in keeping it that way. Morgan greeted me warmly. "I'm so glad you're here, Kelly," she said as she led me through the spacious hallways of the house. "Christopher has been looking forward to meeting you. I've told him so many good things about you." She said he'd heard great things about my skills and dedication from a mutual acquaintance. I could tell she was doing her best to be strong for her brother, even though the whole situation must have been incredibly hard for her. As we walked, I noticed the walls were lined with photographs and paintings, each one telling a story of a life once filled with activity and travel. When we reached Christopher's room, Morgan gently opened the door and introduced us. "Christopher, this is Kelly Johnson, your new nurse. Kelly, this is Christopher Davis." My heart sank upon entering his room. He was lying there, looking up at a ceiling painted with a bright blue sky and fluffy white clouds. It was like a small attempt to bring the outside world in. His body was so still. Morgan told me Christopher had been left completely paralyzed from the neck down after a car accident just a month before. I can't even imagine the sense of loss he must have felt, going from a life full of movement and independence to one where he relied entirely on others for even the most basic tasks. He glanced up at me with a look of expectation in his eyes, and I could feel the weight of his hope pressing against my chest. Morgan quietly left us alone, closing the door softly behind her. It was just the two of us, and I knew that, just like with Evelyn, I had to be strong, not just for myself, but for him, too. As I approached his bedside, I could see the determination in his eyes. Even though his body was weak, his spirit wasn't broken. He spoke to me with a strong voice, telling me how much he appreciated my being there. He said he'd heard I was one of the best in my field, and he wanted me to know how much he valued my support. I adjusted the chair beside his bed to be at his eye level, wanting him to feel comfortable and seen. I assured him that I would do everything in my power to make him feel at ease, to ensure his comfort and happiness. I could sense the weight of my words, knowing how much they meant in that moment. Christopher then began to talk about the accident. He said it was just a minor lapse in concentration while driving, but it changed everything. He had just gotten out of the hospital a few days before I arrived. I could see the pain in his eyes as he talked about it, staring out the window as if he could still see that moment playing out in front of him. I listened carefully, understanding that this was about more than just providing medical care. This was a journey of recovery and self-discovery that we were going to share. I told Christopher that I believed every encounter had a purpose, that we would find the best path through this phase of his life together. I wanted him to know that I was committed to being there for him, no matter what. He nodded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. I could tell that my presence was giving him a small glimmer of light in the darkness he was facing. As we sat there, eating breakfast, I carefully fed him, bringing the spoon to his lips. We talked about the little things we could see outside his window. He pointed out a tree that had started to bloom again, marveling at how beautiful the changing seasons were. He said he had never noticed it before, not like this. It was as if he was seeing the world with new eyes, finding therapy in these moments of reflection. He was learning to appreciate life in a way he never had before, and I was there to witness it. While I was repositioning him in bed to prevent pressure sores, Christopher opened up to me about how he felt like a prisoner in his own body, trapped with no escape. His voice trembled with emotion as he confessed this to me, and my heart ached for him. I gently took his hand, offering him comfort through touch and words. I told him that even though his body had its limitations, his mind and spirit were free to explore new horizons. I wanted him to know that there was still so much he could do, so many ways he could find joy and fulfillment. On the days when the pain was too much, when he couldn't focus on anything else, I tried my best to be a beacon of hope for him. I wanted him to know that he wasn't alone, that together we could find a way through this. Every day, I make sure Christopher gets his meds on time, never letting the pain get a chance to take hold. To distract him from his condition, I often share stories from the outside world he can no longer see. Just the other day, I told him, "Christopher, you won't believe what I saw on my way here." A young whippersnapper was helping an old-timer cross the street. It warmed my heart, I tell you. There's still plenty of kindness in this world, bless their hearts. I try to paint pictures with my words, describing a world Christopher can no longer see with his own eyes. Despite his weakened state, Christopher's spirit remains strong. He started dictating his thoughts to me, and I help record them. It's a journey, he says, from a man who lived on the surface of emotions and success to someone who's found depth in reflection and gratitude for human connections. Every word I dictate, he told me, his voice barely above a whisper, helps me understand that even though I'm confined to this bed, I can still contribute, still make a difference. I could see how my unwavering patience inspired him, and I felt a lump in my throat. This new reality has made Christopher reevaluate everything he once took for granted. Every day, he strives to look beyond his physical condition, seeking ways to grow spiritually and mentally. As time passed, our professional relationship blossomed into a deep, genuine friendship. We'd spend hours talking about life, its challenges, and the lessons we've learned. Our bond grew beyond just physical care. I could see Christopher increasingly saw me as someone who listened carefully, a friend he could trust. One day, he said to me, his voice filled with gratitude, "You know, Kelly, I never thought I'd build such a true friendship while being bedridden. It's funny how life works, isn't it?" I couldn't help but smile. I felt equally grateful to have someone to share not just work responsibilities, but the joys and challenges of life. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was adjusting Christopher's pillows to make him more comfortable. I must have looked more unsettled than usual because Christopher noticed and asked what was worrying me. At first, I hesitated, but finally, I confided in him about the recurring nightmares I'd been having about the day of Michael's accident. Every night, I said, my voice shaking with suppressed emotion, it's like I'm reliving that terrible day. I see the car, hear the brakes, and then I wake up feeling like I've lost everything all over again. Christopher listened carefully and offered words of comfort. "Kelly," he said, grasping my hand with what little strength he had, "I can't even imagine the pain you're carrying. You're a strong woman, a real fighter. I admire you. I believe everything will work out in the end." This exchange marked a significant moment in our friendship. My vulnerability allowed Christopher to feel useful, providing emotional support despite his own condition. On top of dealing with my grief, I was facing the responsibility of raising Evelyn alone. I constantly worried about how her father's absence would affect her life and how my own sadness might impact her. I found myself frequently questioning, am I doing enough for her? Am I being the mother she deserves? These thoughts would hit me especially hard when I'd see Evelyn playing alone, looking far too serious for a child her age. One morning, after a particularly rough night, I confided in Christopher about my fear that my sadness was affecting Evelyn. I confided in Christopher, my voice trembling with emotion, "I'm terrified my pain is casting a shadow over Evelyn's life. How can I be the light in her world when I'm lost in my own darkness?" My words hung in the air as I searched for some kind of solution. Christopher, always the thoughtful one, tried to lift my spirits. He told me that my strength and love for Evelyn shine through, even in my darkest moments. He assured me that Evelyn sees and feels it, and that I'm the best mother she could have. His words were like a warm blanket on a cold day, comforting yet not quite enough to chase away all the chill. One quiet afternoon, as soft sunlight filtered through the curtains in Christopher's room, I noticed he seemed particularly pensive. I could feel the change in his mood, like a shift in the air before a storm, and I asked if something was bothering him. Christopher took a deep breath, and I could see the decision in his eyes to share a part of his past that almost no one knew. He began, his voice thick with regret, "Kelly, there's something I've never told you about who I was before the accident. I wasn't a good person." As he continued, I listened intently, surprised and a bit shocked by his honesty. He described how he had been overly ambitious, stepping on others to climb the career ladder. He admitted to manipulating a colleague who fell victim to his selfish actions. As he spoke, he stared at his hands as if he could still see the traces of that time on them. I asked him, gently prodding him to continue, how he felt about it now. Christopher sighed, a mix of relief and anguish at revealing his secret. He expressed deep regret, explaining that since the accident, he's had plenty of time to think about the pain he caused. With a touch of irony in his voice, he mused that perhaps the accident was some kind of divine punishment, placing him in a position of helplessness. Moved by Christopher's confession, I placed my hand on his in a gesture of support. I told him that acknowledging his past was a big step. "We all have shadows in our past," I said, "but recognizing them and wanting to change is what redefines us." My words weren't just offering forgiveness, but encouragement for him to move forward. Encouraged by my understanding, Christopher continued. He shared that the hardest part for him was living with the weight of guilt. Part of him wished he could go back and correct his mistakes. He wondered if caring for Evelyn and me might be a way to start making amends for the harm he'd done. His words reflected a deep desire for redemption. Deeply touched by Christopher's vulnerability, I felt my loyalty and support for him grow stronger. I smiled and squeezed his hand firmly, reassuring him that we all deserve second chances. I told him that even in his current situation, he was trying to be a better person, and that said a lot about him. "It's not the past that defines us," I said, "but how we use the lessons it brings." As I held his hand, I felt like we were both affirming our commitment to face the ghosts of the past together and build a more hopeful future. One hectic morning, I received a call from Evelyn's school. There was a problem with the heating system, and classes were cancelled for the rest of the day. With little time to arrange an alternative for my daughter and no friends or relatives available at that moment, I made the decision to bring Evelyn with me to work. As we rushed to Christopher's house, I explained to Evelyn, "You'll need to stay quiet and read your books while I work, okay?" It reminded me of the times when I was a young mother, trying to balance work and childcare. Those were challenging days, but they taught me resilience, just like now. When we arrived, Evelyn was right by my side, her backpack bursting with books, her curiosity palpable. It reminded me of when I was a young nurse, always eager to learn and explore. I introduced her to Christopher, explaining the unexpected situation at school that brought her here today. Evelyn, bless her heart, has always been a little chatterbox with a knack for making friends. She greeted Christopher with a smile that could light up a room, telling him how much I'd talked about him. It was like watching a ray of sunshine break through storm clouds. Christopher's face, which I'd grown used to seeing etched with pain and worry, suddenly lit up with the biggest smile I'd seen since his accident. It was like seeing a different man altogether. He welcomed Evelyn warmly, telling her how much he'd heard about her too and encouraging her to make herself at home. As I went about my work, I couldn't help but notice the change in the room's atmosphere. Evelyn had plopped herself down on the floor and was busy drawing, her creativity flowing as freely as a mountain stream. Christopher was watching her, completely captivated. It was as if he'd forgotten his own troubles for a moment. Evelyn started explaining her drawings to Christopher. She'd created a whole world on that piece of paper, a castle with a dragon to protect it. It took me back to the days when my own children were young, their imaginations running wild and free. Christopher jumped right into Evelyn's game. He asked her if she liked dragon stories, and before I knew it, they were spinning tales together about dragons and princesses. Christopher suggested that castles should have good dragons to protect people rather than scare them. The joy on Evelyn's face was infectious, lighting up the room more than any sunshine could. For a brief moment, I saw Christopher forget his worries. He was lost in the world they were creating together. It was a beautiful thing to witness, like watching flowers bloom in fast motion. Evelyn, with her boundless energy, wasn't done yet. While Christopher and I were discussing his treatment, she piped up with a new idea. "Let's play hide and seek," she declared, her smile mischievous. She looked at us with those challenging eyes that only a child can muster, explaining the rules as if we'd never played before. "Mom, count to 20 while I hide. You have to guess where I am," she exclaimed, already bouncing on her toes, ready to dash off. Christopher, despite being confined to his bed, was all for it. He nodded and smiled at Evelyn's enthusiasm. It was like watching a spark reignite a flame that had almost gone out. I closed my eyes and started counting loudly, giving Evelyn time to hide. 1, 2, 3, I called out, listening to the pitter-patter of her feet as she scurried around the room. As I counted, I could hear Evelyn scampering around the room, her excitement palpable in the air.
Evelyn looked around the room, searching for a hiding spot that no one would think to check. Her eyes fell on the dark space under Christopher's large bed. "They'll never think to look here," she thought to herself. Crouching down, she quietly slipped into the shadowy space. The stillness under the bed felt like a different world to Evelyn. It was her own little universe, perfect for hiding. As she settled into the darkness, Evelyn's small flashlight illuminated an odd object in the corner. Curiosity got the better of her, and she reached out, touching something unexpected. It was cold and smooth, sparking a wave of curiosity in her adventure-hungry mind. "What could this be?" she whispered to herself, feeling the texture and trying to identify the mysterious object. The item seemed strange and out of place, completely capturing Evelyn's attention. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized it was something significant, something she never expected to find there. It was a tablet. Evelyn wiped the dusty screen with her sleeve and pressed the power button, wondering what secrets this hidden device might reveal. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the dark space under the bed and displaying app icons and photos. Instinctively, she tapped on the photo album. With her heart racing in anticipation of the unknown, Evelyn swiped through the images. One photo, in particular, caught her eye. It was clearly an old picture, taken years ago, showing a man she immediately recognized. Her father was smiling next to Christopher, who was now lying in the bed above her. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock, unable to immediately grasp the connection. "How is this possible?" she whispered to herself, a mix of confusion and growing realization washing over her. She examined the photo more closely, observing the details. The two men were dressed for a party, perhaps a celebration or important event. Both held glasses in their hands and wore big smiles. It was evident they were sharing a joyous moment. Were Dad and Christopher friends? Evelyn wondered, feeling as if she had stumbled upon a carefully guarded secret. Still holding the tablet, Evelyn emerged from her hiding place under the bed. Though still in shock, she now felt an urgent need to understand what this image meant.
I was counting, lost in my own thoughts, when suddenly Evelyn burst into the room. Her eyes were wide with excitement, and she was clutching a tablet in her hands. "Look what I found!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and confusion. Christopher and Dad were friends. Isn't that incredible? My heart skipped a beat as I looked at the screen she was holding up. There, clear as day, was a photo of my late husband Michael standing next to Christopher, both of them smiling and looking years younger. It was like seeing a ghost, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. As the reality of what I was seeing sunk in, I felt the color drain from my face. 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but I couldn't form the words to ask Christopher. The implications of this image were swirling in my head like a tornado. Finally, I found my voice. "Christopher," I said, my words barely above a whisper, "you knew Michael? How? Why hasn't this come up before now?" I could hear the tremor in my voice, feel the shock giving way to a wave of conflicting emotions. Christopher looked like a deer caught in headlights. He glanced from the photo to me, then back again, clearly realizing there was no way to avoid the truth now. "Kelly," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "yes, I knew Michael. We worked together years ago. I should have told you sooner." As Christopher's confession unfolded, I could see Evelyn watching us, her eyes darting back and forth between us. Bless her heart, she looked like she was realizing she might have opened a door to the past that should have stayed closed. But isn't that always the way with kids? They have a knack for stumbling upon the very things we try to keep hidden. I couldn't take my eyes off Christopher. The initial shock was quickly being replaced by a rising sense of betrayal. "Christopher," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disappointment, "why didn't you ever mention you knew Michael? Why keep this hidden from me all this time?" Each word felt heavy, laden with the pain of discovery and the feeling that the trust between us had been shattered. It was like finding out your best friend had been keeping a secret from you for years. I could see the guilt written all over Christopher's face as he registered the hurt in my eyes. He looked like a man who knew this moment would come but had always feared its arrival. "Kelly, I hesitated," he started, fumbling for words. At the time, I thought revealing our past would only bring more pain, more complications. I wanted to avoid that. His voice trailed off as he tried to justify his silence, but I couldn't let him finish. "You wanted to protect yourself, Christopher. But what about me and my daughter?" I interrupted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. As I listened to Christopher, I felt a storm of emotions brewing inside me. Frustration and confusion were swirling together, shaping my words as I spoke. "Michael was my husband, Evelyn's father," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Don't you think I had a right to know about your shared past? What kind of friend, what kind of person, keeps something like this hidden?" I was shaking, trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with these new revelations. It was like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. I noticed Christopher glancing at Evelyn, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. He seemed to realize that this was a conversation that needed to happen without little ears around. With a gentleness that surprised me, given the tension in the room, Christopher turned to Evelyn. "Evelyn, sweetheart," he said, his voice as calm as a still lake, "I'm feeling a little thirsty. Would you mind bring me a glass of water from the kitchen?" Evelyn, always eager to help, jumped at the chance. "Of course, Christopher. I'll get it right away," she chirped, oblivious to the storm brewing in the room. She bounced out of the room, on a mission to get that water. As soon as Evelyn left, Christopher's demeanor changed. His face became serious. "Kelly," he began, his voice low and grave, "I don't want to discuss this in front of Evelyn. What happened between Michael and me, it's not something she needs to hear right now. I felt my eyebrows shoot up in surprise. What could be so bad that it needed to be kept from Evelyn? "Christopher," I said, my voice a mix of concern and curiosity, "what are you trying to say? What happened between you and Michael that can't be said in front of my daughter? You're making me more worried by the second." Christopher let out a heavy sigh, like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Kelly," he said, his voice heavy with the importance of the moment, "this is a long and complicated story. It's full of past regrets and mistakes. Decisions I made, they directly affected Michael's life, I'm afraid. I need you to listen with an open heart. And Evelyn, she doesn't need to hear this now. It would be too much for her to bear." I could see he was preparing for a difficult but necessary conversation. It reminded me of those parent-teacher conferences back in the day, where you knew you were about to hear something you might not like. "I'm going to tell you everything about what happened with Michael," Christopher continued. "About the mistake that led to his dismissal, how it affected his life, and my guilt in all of it." I could see the pain etched on Christopher's face. He knew his next words could change everything between us, but he also seemed to understand that the truth was the only way forward now. "Kelly," he began, his voice filled with regret, "when I knew Michael, I was a completely different person. I was ambitious, selfish, and I'm ashamed to say, willing to do almost anything to advance my career." As I listened, I felt like I was on a roller coaster of emotions, climbing higher with each word, dreading the inevitable drop that was sure to come. As Christopher continued his confession, I felt like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion. Each word he spoke was like a blow to my heart. He told me that Michael had been his colleague, a brilliant professional. Christopher admitted that Michael's excellence had threatened him in some way. Out of selfishness and fear of losing his position, he had schemed against Michael. I could see the pain etched on Christopher's face as he spoke. It was as if each word was tearing a piece of his soul away. "I got what I wanted," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Michael was fired, and I got the promotion I'd been after." Christopher couldn't meet my eyes as he continued to explain the impact of his actions. He told me how years later, he'd learned that Michael had a family, a wife and daughter he deeply loved. When he heard about Michael's tragic death in a car accident, regret began to eat away at him. As Christopher spoke, I could see tears welling up in his eyes. He confessed that he couldn't help but wonder if his greed had somehow set off a chain of events that led Michael down that path. Then Christopher dropped another bombshell. After his own accident that left him bedridden, he began to see it as divine punishment. A retribution for the mistakes he'd made, the pain he'd caused to good people like Michael, and indirectly to me and Evelyn. Finally, Christopher looked at me, his eyes filled with raw sincerity. He explained that's why he had sought me out. Not just for me to care for him, but as a form of atonement. He knew he couldn't bring Michael back or erase the harm he'd caused, but he hoped that by helping Evelyn and me, he could find some form of redemption. His voice choked with emotion as he told me he'd decided to leave part of his estate to Evelyn and me. Not as a payment, but as a gesture, a small step towards correcting a big mistake from the past. As Christopher finished, I could see him watching me anxiously, both fearing and hoping for the possibility of forgiveness. I sat there, frozen by his confession, feeling a whirlwind of chaotic emotions. Anger was boiling inside me like a volcano about to erupt. At the same time, a deep sadness and an odd compassion for Christopher began to soften the edges of my fury. I tried to absorb every word, every confession of remorse that he expressed. But part of me still refused to accept that the person responsible for my husband's misfortune was sitting right in front of me. As Christopher waited quietly, I began to relive a painful memory. I vividly recalled the day Michael came home devastated, telling me he'd lost his job because of a colleague's malicious actions. One of my colleagues set me up, Kelly, Michael had said, his voice filled with disbelief and sadness. I don't know why he'd do something like that, but he wanted the promotion we were both competing for. At the time, I had tried to comfort him, but now, connecting the dots, my heart clenched even tighter. The revelation that Christopher was that colleague brought a new, painful perspective to the events that followed. After losing his job, Michael had been forced to look for another way to make a living, which led him to work as a taxi driver. It was during a night shift that the tragic accident occurred, taking his life. I felt overwhelmed by the agonizing realization. If Michael hadn't been forced to change careers, I thought to myself, maybe he'd still be alive. If he'd never become a taxi driver, he could be here with us now. As I sat there, my mind reeling, I couldn't help but mutter to myself, how could this have happened? Tears began to well up in my eyes, and I felt like I was spinning out of control. I looked at Christopher, really looked at him, and saw genuine sorrow and regret etched on his face. Part of me wanted to scream, to banish him from my life forever. But at the same time, I realized he was broken too, carved up by guilt and a desperate desire for redemption. How did you live with this, Christopher? I asked, my voice quavering with emotion. How could you look me in the eye all these months and not say a word? Christopher bowed his head, and I could see fresh tears starting to fall. He told me he had no excuses. He'd been afraid to face the truth, afraid I'd hate him. But he knew that didn't justify what he'd done. He apologized, his voice barely above a whisper, and I could hear the weight of his remorse in every word. As I tried to absorb it all, I felt like I was caught in an internal tug-of-war. Part of me wanted to forgive, to let go of this pain. Another part wanted to run as far away from the source of my hurt as possible. I knew I couldn't change the past, but now I was faced with the decision of how to deal with the future. I found myself mulling over Christopher's words, considering the impact his actions had on my life and Evelyn's. Just then, the door opened softly, and in came Evelyn, carefully balancing a glass of water in both hands. Bless her heart, she was trying so hard not to spill a drop. She approached Christopher with a sweet smile and handed him the glass, completely oblivious to the tension that had been filling the room moments before. Christopher accepted the glass with a gentle smile, thanking Evelyn for being so careful. His voice was still thick with emotion from our conversation, but he managed to take a sip, trying to compose himself. As I watched this interaction, still lost in my own thoughts, I glanced at the clock and realized the day was already starting to fade into evening. Time had a funny way of slipping by when your world was being turned upside down. I looked at the clock and realized it was time to head home. Evelyn, honey, it's time to go, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Lord knows I needed time to process everything Christopher had revealed and figure out how to move forward. It was like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing and the other half from a different puzzle entirely. As we were getting ready to leave, Christopher's night shift caregiver arrived, ready to take over. Evelyn had no idea of the emotional tornado that had just swept through the room. Evelyn, sweet child that she is, ran over to Christopher and gave him a big hug. Goodbye, Christopher. See you later, she chirped, her voice full of childish joy. It was like watching a ray of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. I could see Christopher was touched by Evelyn's gesture. For a moment, pain flashed across his face. In a sudden burst of emotion, he hugged her back and whispered, "Forgive me, little one." Evelyn stepped back, looking at him with confusion written all over her face. She asked him why he was asking for forgiveness, her voice filled with genuine bewilderment. Christopher seemed to realize the innocence of her question. He gave a sad smile and shook his head. He told her it was complicated, but asked if she could just accept his apology. His voice was shaking like a leaf in the wind. Evelyn, always ready with a generous heart, simply said she accepted his apology. That child has a heart of gold. As we left the room, I felt like I was leaving Christopher alone with his thoughts, while I had a whole mess of decisions to ponder myself. The walk home was quiet as a church mouse. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Evelyn, unaware of the weight of the day's revelations, chatted about little things she noticed on the way, bringing moments of lightness to the heavy atmosphere. When we got home, Evelyn, tuckered out from the intense afternoon, went straight to bed, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence of the house seeming to amplify the sound of my worries. I made myself a cup of tea, watching the steam slowly rise as I stared into the hot liquid. With each sip, I tried to calm the storm inside me, but Christopher's words kept echoing in my mind, refusing to be ignored. I thought about Michael. About the love we shared and the hardships we overcame together. The idea that Christopher, someone I had started to consider a friend, had played such a crucial role in Michael's downfall was almost unbearable. For a moment, I seriously considered quitting my job with Christopher. Can I really continue caring for someone who caused my family so much harm? I asked myself. It was a difficult situation. As I sat there, my heart felt like it was caught in a vice, squeezed by pain and moral dilemma. The decision to forgive or walk away loomed before me like a yawning chasm. Either choice would have profound consequences. The kitchen clock ticked away, marking the passage of time. Each second reminded me that while my inner world had come to a screeching halt, the outside world kept on turning, oblivious to my turmoil. I found myself staring into space, my now cold tea sitting in front of me. My mind swung like a pendulum between loyalty to the past and the responsibilities of the present. That night, sleep was elusive. Conflicting thoughts and emotions kept me tossing and turning. As the first rays of dawn peeked through the window, I dragged myself out of bed, feeling the weight of the decision I had to make bearing down on me. I went through the motions of helping Evelyn get ready for school, my movements mechanical but careful. It was like being on autopilot. The morning routine became a temporary refuge from the turbulent thoughts that had been hounding me. It reminded me of those days back when Michael was alive, and we'd get Evelyn ready together. On the way to drop Evelyn off at school, I tried to focus on her chatter. She was going on about her plans for the day, excited about her art class. "Mom, I'm going to paint a picture for you today," she said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. I couldn't help but smile. Her innocence and joy were like a balm to my wounded soul, bringing light to even my darkest days. After dropping Evelyn off, I headed to Christopher's house. The possibility of resigning weighed heavily on my mind. Can I really continue working for a man who's caused my family so much pain? I wondered, feeling a mix of anguish and a sense of duty. The decision seemed clear-cut, but at the same time, it felt impossibly difficult. It was like trying to choose between a rock and a hard place. When I arrived at Christopher's house, I took a deep breath before entering. It felt like I was about to step into the lion's den. I walked to Christopher's room, each step echoing my inner conflict. When I opened the door, I found Christopher awake, gazing out the window. He looked lost in thought, like he was a million miles away. When he noticed me, his face lit up with a mixture of hope and fear. It was like watching a child who's been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, hoping for forgiveness but fearing punishment. As our eyes met, I could see the deep sincerity and regret in Christopher's gaze. It was like looking into a well of sorrow and hope all mixed together. Christopher started to speak, hesitating like a child about to confess to breaking a vase. I could see him struggling to find the right words. I raised my hand to stop him. "You don't need to say anything more, Christopher," I said, my voice firm but gentle, like I used to use with Evelyn when she was little. "I see the sincerity in your eyes, and I've decided to forgive you." I took a deep breath before continuing. Not for you, but for myself. I can't keep carrying this grudge around like a heavy suitcase. It's time to move forward. Christopher's relief was as visible as a neon sign. He just nodded, seemingly unable to express his gratitude in words. He looked like he'd just been given a second chance at life. I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I knew I'd made the right decision. I'd chosen peace. I'd chosen forgiveness. Not to forget, mind you, but to free myself and give Evelyn a future without the shadows of the past. With my mind made up, I started my day's work. I decided to continue caring for Christopher, not just as a nurse, but as someone who deeply understood the complexity of regret and forgiveness. It's funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? After a long, emotionally challenging day, I went to pick up Evelyn from school. She came running with a big smile, holding a painting she'd made in art class. "Look, Mom. I made this for you," she exclaimed, handing me the colorful masterpiece. I accepted it with a warm smile and a big hug. "It's beautiful, sweetie," I told her. "Let's put it on the fridge so we can see it every day." For a moment, I felt a sense of peace in the lightness of my daughter's childlike joy. Back home, I started preparing dinner while Evelyn chatted away about her day. The kitchen filled with the aroma of homemade tomato sauce and pasta, comfort food at its finest. As I listened to Evelyn's school adventures, I couldn't help but think about how much our lives had changed, and how much they were about to change again. In the midst of that everyday routine, there was the comforting balm needed after a day of tension. After dinner, I looked at Evelyn and said, "Sweetheart, once you've finished tidying up, let's have a little chat in the bedroom." Evelyn, ever curious, nodded. She was used to these serious conversations about important values that happened from time to time. In her room, sitting side by side on her star-patterned bedspread, I began to speak gently. "Evelyn, today I want to talk about something important, about forgiveness. Do you know what forgiveness means?" I asked, carefully choosing my words to match her understanding. Thoughtful Evelyn answered with the innocence of a 10-year-old, "It's when someone does something wrong, and you don't stay mad at them anymore." I smiled, feeling a surge of pride in my daughter's insight. "That's right, darling. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, but about not letting anger control us. Sometimes, people make big mistakes or small ones. Forgiveness heals our hearts and helps us move forward," I explained, keeping the specifics of my conflict with Christopher to myself, focusing instead on making sure Evelyn understood. "Do you think we should always forgive, Mom?" Evelyn asked, looking at me seriously. "I think we should try to forgive as much as possible. Today, I chose to forgive someone. Not because what they did wasn't wrong, but because I don't want to live with anger. And I want to teach you that too," I replied, hugging her close. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully, her young face reflecting a maturity beyond her years. "I understand, Mom. I'll try to forgive even if it's hard when someone hurts me. If you can do it, I can too. It will make me happy and not sad," she said. Her voice carried a wisdom that belied her age. "Yes, Evelyn. Forgiving will make you happier and lighter in heart. Forgiveness is a powerful thing. I'm so proud of you for understanding this at such a young age," I told her, feeling waves of relief and satisfaction at seeing her grasp such an important value. Seeing Evelyn absorb such a crucial lesson, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Evelyn smiled, pleased with her mother's approval, then changed the topic to a lighter one more appropriate for her age. "Mom, will you read the new storybook you got for me? I like when you read to me. It makes me feel safe," she requested, eager to extend our special time together. "Of course, sweetheart. There's nothing I would enjoy more," I answered, grateful for this simple yet profound moment with my daughter. We spent the rest of the evening together, reading and sharing stories, further deepening our bond. Looking back on that day, I found solace in knowing that, despite the challenges, I was guiding Evelyn to grow into a compassionate and understanding person. Our conversation had reinforced my decision to continue working with Christopher. Seeing my daughter absorb and reflect on the lessons she was learning was uplifting. Evelyn's ability to grasp and accept important concepts like forgiveness convinced me that she was on the right path, both as my child and as a person. By the end of the day, with Evelyn sleeping beside me, I felt a deep sense of calm. Strengthened by my belief that love and forgiveness truly hold transformative power. As I watched my sleeping daughter, I made a silent promise to her of kindness and resilience. Grateful beyond measure for having such a tender and understanding daughter. The following weekend, I decided to take Evelyn to see Christopher. The morning was bright and full of hope. On our way to Christopher's house, I explained to Evelyn how crucial support and encouragement are for someone recovering physically and emotionally. Visiting the people we care about can make a huge difference for those who are feeling down, I told her while glancing at Evelyn in the rearview mirror. Evelyn nodded, excited at the thought of seeing Christopher. When we arrived, Christopher greeted us with a smile. The smile was genuine but couldn't quite hide a certain sadness and physical discomfort. His body was still weak, and the pain he was enduring was evident in his cautious and slow movements. "Hello, Evelyn." "Hello, Kelly. It's always a pleasure to see you," he said. Trying to convey enthusiasm, his voice betrayed the effort it took. During the visit, while discussing his progress with rehabilitation, Christopher confided in us about the difficulties he was facing. "I'm making small progress with the exercises, but honestly, each movement is a challenge and often quite painful," he explained. I observed him carefully, my emotions a mix of pride in his determination and concern for the pain he still faced. "You're making amazing efforts, Christopher. I understand how hard it is. If you need anything, we're here for you," I encouraged him. Evelyn, sensitive to Christopher's condition, looked at him with a sympathetic gaze. "You're so strong, Christopher. I drew a picture for you to help you get better," Evelyn said, handing him a colorful drawing she had made at school. Despite the atmosphere filled with support and affection, the sadness in Christopher's eyes was unmistakable. He appreciated Evelyn's gesture and my support, but his expression revealed an inner conflict. A mix of gratitude and pain. "Thank you, Evelyn. I'll keep your drawing here, by my side," he said, gently holding the picture. "And Kelly, I'm grateful for everything. Even on the toughest days, having you both close is a comfort," he added. His smile, despite the pain, showed a struggle to stay positive. As we prepared to leave, Christopher expressed his heartfelt gratitude for the visit. He said that our visit had brightened his day and wished us the very best. "I hope for the best for you. I truly wish you happiness," he concluded, his smile revealing his effort to overcome the pain. Evelyn and I left feeling both fulfilled by our visit and sorrowful for Christopher's suffering. I was already thinking about how to continue helping him, recognizing that his path to recovery was still long and challenging. In the early hours of Monday, the sudden ring of my phone shattered the night's silence. With a tightening in my chest, I answered the call, fearing the worst. The trembling voice on the other end brought me news I never wanted to hear. "Kelly, I'm so sorry to tell you, but Christopher's condition worsened suddenly, and he's passed away." Those words struck me like a lightning bolt, leaving me immobilized. Still holding the phone to my ear, I was overwhelmed by waves of shock and grief. In the following days, I struggled to accept the reality of Christopher's loss. The man whose journey of redemption had deeply touched my life. I knew I had to be strong, not only for myself, but mainly for Evelyn. Evelyn, too, felt the loss of someone who had become special to us. I carefully prepared Evelyn for the funeral, explaining that it would be a chance to say goodbye and pay our final respects. On the day of the funeral, Evelyn held my hand tightly, tears welling up in her eyes as she walked beside me. The church was hushed, filled with people mourning Christopher's departure. Evelyn was profoundly shaken and cried. Her small body shook with each sob. I leaned over lovingly and comforted my daughter in a soothing voice. "Evelyn, I know it's a very sad time," I said softly. "But you need to remember that Christopher is in a place where he no longer feels pain or suffering." I tried to ease Evelyn's pain with words of comfort and hope. Evelyn gazed at me, struggling to fully grasp her words. "But I miss Christopher so much, Mom." "He was our friend," Evelyn said, tears still streaming down her cheeks. I embraced Evelyn, feeling the weight of her own sorrow while recalling the happy memories she had shared with Christopher. After the funeral, Evelyn and I went through a period of mourning and reflection. Despite Christopher's flaws and the difficult path he had walked, he left behind a final surprise that would only be revealed weeks later. Christopher's lawyer informed us that, despite being single and childless, Christopher had decided to leave half of his estate to his sister Morgan, and the other half to me and my daughter Evelyn. This distribution was explained as a way for Christopher to atone for his mistakes throughout his life and contribute, in some form, to a better future for Evelyn and me. I was astonished and deeply moved by Christopher's generosity and the intent of his atonement. In the days that followed, I pondered much about Christopher's legacy. Christopher's decision to include us in his will did more than ease our financial worries. It served as a constant reminder of the power of forgiveness and personal transformation. "Christopher gave us a second chance, Evelyn," I explained one evening as we prepared dinner together in the kitchen. "And with it, we can do a lot of good." Christopher's tumultuous story became a valuable lesson for Evelyn and I. We learned that despite someone's failures or mistakes, there is always room for atonement and life-changing acts. Thus, even in Christopher's physical absence, his spirit of generosity and atonement lived on, touching our lives in a deeply enduring way.
If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me keep sharing amazing stories every day. Don't miss the next incredible tale. It's right there on your screen. Thank you so much for your support. See you again soon.